A question about language about God. Is it disingenuous, if not inevitable, to continue in trying to describe God while at the same time knowing that we really can't describe God? What are our choices?
Yes. So I think this is Feuerbach's claim. He basically says negative theologians should just bite the bullet and accept God doesn't exist. But I think I think we just need to embrace the paradox that we can't describe what God is really like, if there is a God, and yet language is all we have, right? And again, I think what matters is how do we utilize God talk to accomplish something in the world, and what are we trying to accomplish? So I think it's only disingenuous if we think we've arrived at some kind of like, now we have all the right metaphors and we can stop. No, it's a continual process of coming up with new metaphors for God.
Yes. And you are Presbyterian, going to a Presbyterian church community, and it does strike me that Reformed theology can be very systematic in describing the nature and attributes of God.
Yeah.
How do you square that?
So I was very much raised to think in a very systematic way of how we could know about God, right? So in my upbringing, it was as if, let's just catalog all the different things that the Bible says about God, and we'll make a really long list, and then we're done, right? It's as if that view of the Bible is as if the Bible is a textbook. Or as the acronym I was raised as a kid, Bible means basic instructions before leaving Earth. And I've come to think of the Bible not as a textbook, right? This is a catalog of different people throughout long history trying to come up with different ways of talking about God, and sometimes they disagree with each other. The Bible disagrees with itself. And so I see that as a kind of invitation to participate in that discussion, in that argument, in fact, about what we think about God. So it's a different way of thinking about how sacred texts work.
Okay. Some questions about science. Does chemistry, which is the breaking down the substance of things into subatomic particles, on the one hand, and astrophysics, exploring the substance of things in our ever-inflationary universe, on the other hand, does that alter our descriptions, conceptions, and language about God? Yeah. So, and actually, what did the advent of modern science do for this discussion beginning in the 18th century?
So I teach a science and religion class, and I tell my students, I'm not a scientist, right? So some of them probably know more about science than I do, right? So I'll do my very best here. But on the massive level of astrophysics, I like to point out that the theory of the Big Bang was conceived by a Catholic priest named George Lemaitre. He's probably the most important scientist of the 20th century. He was a friend of Albert Einstein, and Albert Einstein famously said, God does not play with dice. And when Albert Einstein said that, he meant to say that the universe is static. Lemaitre proved him wrong, and proved by studying basically the fact that stars are moving away from us, red spots, that the universe is expanding, right? The universe is evolving, and this completely changes the way we think about reality. So that's on the big level. On the teeny tiny level of subatomic particles, we are learning, and again, don't test me on my knowledge as subatomic particles, but we are learning crazy things, right? So scientists have been able to split a proton and put them in 500 miles away from each other. I don't know how they do this. And they start turning half of this proton and the other half starts turning. It's called quantum entanglement. We know that subatomic particles can go through walls. We know subatomic particles can go from one place to another without traversing the space between. We know that electrons only have a location when somebody is looking at them. I don't know how to explain all of that to you, but all of these things are calling into question the idea of a static universe and are pointing toward this kind of more integrated web of mutuality that I try to describe.
And those 4 buckets that you've named, 4 ways of thinking, of describing God, in which of those buckets would you put the radical shorthand description of God is love? What are the ramifications of that definition, God is love?
Oh, man.
Which is stated in the New Testament in the first line of John, in that short definition of God, yeah. God is love.
Yeah. What are the ramifications that God is love? So Caputo, who I'm very indebted to, he used to teach at Villanova. He suggests, that there's this infinite play of words. I'm not sure if it's infinite, but he suggests what happens when we reverse the order, that love is God. How does this change the way we think about these terms? I think that's one way to try to answer this question. Thinking along the lines of Levinas, who I mentioned, I'm reminded of 1 John. 1 John says that whoever says they love God but despise their brother or sister is lying to you, right? And so, their love of God, we tend to think of this as kind of a vertical relationship. For Levinas and other Jewish thinkers, love of God is always discovered through my relationship through the other person, right? And so I don't know how to summarize that other than, who is my neighbor, and what does that look like to accomplish that command to love your neighbor?
Okay. In the Christian contemplative tradition, which makes use of meditation techniques such as centering prayer, following Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint Teresa and Saint John of the Cross, it's been described as a spirituality of the via negativa, the emphasizing the way of the negation of thoughts, including thoughts about God, as a way of getting closer to God. How would you put that into your schema of the 4 buckets?
Into a schema?
Well, I shouldn't say schema. In your 4 ways of describing language about God, when specifically they're saying you can get closer to God by letting go the thoughts.
Yeah. So Avila, in her text, the name of the text is escaping me. Interior Castle. Yeah. In an Interior Castle, she has kind of seven moments or 7 places that you have to move through in order to encounter God. Interestingly, Maimonides in the Guide of the Perplexed also have 7 stages onto encountering God. So the via negativa or apophatic theology of Teresa of Avila is very similar to what we see in Maimonides and his negative theology, that we get closer to God by kind of eliminating our descriptions of God. So it fits within that notion of mystical theology or negative theology.
The Lakota Native American people describe God as Wakantanka, that which has many parts, like an infinite force. Can you comment on this non-Western characterization of God? And easier questions like that.
So I think there are, it would be, what's the right word? I would be reductive to kind of say all native religious traditions are the same in how they conceptualize God. There are a multitude of ways of conceptualizing God in Native traditions. I'm particularly inspired by a number of Native American thinkers, like Robin Wall Kimmerer in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. She has this really great essay called the animacy of living things, right? And so she points out in English, the majority of our words are nouns. So we think of podium, chair, mic, person as separate things. In her Anishinaabe language, the majority of words are verbs, right? And so in Anishinaabe, you don't say lake, but you say to lake. The lake is alive. And I think this is right, when we think about God as an event or God as a ground of being, this aligns with that. This idea that the world is alive. It has this, like, right, it's the mechanistic approach to science has done us a disservice by thinking of the world as just like a clock. And Native American traditions tend to think of the world as this living, breathing being, right? And I very much resonate with that.
One questioner wanted to take us back to, well, what you were singing about, Go Down Moses. Let's go back to Moses. Abu Musa, God said, go to Pharaoh and tell them to let my people go. And Moses asked, what is your name? Well, who are you? And the answer was, and I can't do it in Hebrew successfully, I am.
I am.
I am that I am.
Yep.
Here to comment on.
Oh, this is great. This is totally coming from a philosopher at Boston College, Professor Kearney. Kearney, wow, okay, the voice of God. No. Actually, I prefer Elijah, right? Elijah encounters God not through the thunderstorm, but through a voice that the Hebrew suggested is like the nothing, right? Anyways, so Richard Carney, he's a professor who's he's a colleague of John Caputo, who I mentioned earlier, and he points out that, right, Hebrew, that the God mentioned in Exodus 3, I am that I am, it can also be translated as I may be what I may be.
Yes.
Right? And so there's this kind of God of possibility. And I'm very compelled by that. Yeah.
Yes. Is that similar to Alfred North Whitehead's process?
Possibly. I think I would put it closer with Caputo's notion of God as an event, right? The God of, like, a God that solicits us into the future. But I vacillate between those two, so.
You said that anthropomorphism, and would you describe what that is again? Well, you said that anthropomorphism is idolatry. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't it make sense, though, if God did create humans in God's own image, that certain of God's attributes would become ours, however imperfect they may be?
Yeah, this is a great question. So much of the Western philosophical tradition, right, which is influenced by Greek thought and then permutated through Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, has over time concluded that when that Genesis 1 says God created humans in the image of God, that is effectively rationality. What makes you like God is your reason. But that's not how ancient people understood that concept. So as I understand it from Hebrew scholars, to be made in the image of God is like being an ambassador, right? So imagine, like, you know, a king who has a signet ring and puts his ring into the wax, and that's a reflection of the king. Right? This is kind of what that text is saying, that we are ambassadors for God in the world. But I think, right, there's this, so the tradition has reduced this to rationality, and I think there's some significant drawbacks to that. What about emotion? Does God have emotion? Maimonides would say no, but I think this leads to a dualism that's often very unhelpful for us thinking about how we live and move in the world as humans. So I think this is an open question of that we should continually explore. What does it mean to be made in the image of God?
Okay. And now just a little confession, a personal confession. I really don't know what intersubjectivity as dialectical spiral means. But no one asked a question about it, so I guess you're off the hook on that. But I also can be given to describing God as ground of being, ultimate concern. But here's the problem, and it's related to what one questioner asked: how do you communicate this? So a 7-year-old asks the parent, "Who is God?" And you say, well, God is the ground of all being. Or God is the ultimate concern. And it's hard to translate that.
Yeah.
Which then, it's so much easier to say,
Yep.
God is your loving parent.
Yep.
Your husband.
Yeah. Right. So I have 2 kids, and they, for my PhD dissertation, they were kind of my guinea pigs for my PhD writing, and my earlier work was on philosophy of childhood. And the first thing I'll say is, I think we underestimate how smart children are. We underestimate how capable they are of handling complexity. We think that they only think in black and white, and it's just not true. And so I would suggest using, like Tillich suggests, lots of metaphors, lots of symbols. God is like X, right? God is like breath. God is like a parent. God is like, we'll fill in the blank, right? And give them a whole multitude of different metaphors. Let them play. Let them be creative. Ask them, what is God like? I've even, in my college classes, I've given my students, when I've taught Maimonides, I've given my students a piece of paper and asked them to draw a picture of God, just to see what they do. It's so cool. It's so cool, right? So just, what does it look like to play? Right? So Kierkegaard, who's one of my favorite philosophers, Kierkegaard said at the end of Fear and Trembling that, right, how we've come to think about God is like a child who's gone on vacation and by noon has run out of things to do, right? And he wants us to return to that childlike imagination. That's what I think that's what the word God invites us to do.
I'm reminded of the 4-year-old girl who was asked by a teacher, "Oh, Annie, what are you drawing?" She says, "I'm drawing God." And the teacher says, "Well, nobody knows what God looks like." And Annie replies, "They will in a few minutes." Let's see, which one of these? This one, you feel free to not answer this if you want. It's a more personal one. It's not mine, but when you pray, what, if anything, do you visualize?
It probably depends on the day. But sometimes just not really anything. And maybe because I have a much broader definition of what counts as prayer these days. Help just sounds like a good prayer.
Yes.
Oh God is a prayer. Save us is a prayer.
Perhaps that's why so many more modern persons of faith, in addition to their various denominations or religions' depictions of God, have been drawn more and more, at least in the West, to more meditative techniques. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's a reaction against over-explaining who God is. And so the way of getting closer to God is drawn into the love beyond words.
Yeah.
Beyond.
Right. Silence has been a spiritual discipline of religious traditions for centuries.
Yes.
Right. So there's something really profound about this. What happens when we are silent? Right? What do we notice about ourselves? What fills that space? And maybe, again, maybe that's an appropriate space to use the word God. What fills that space when we are silent?
In many interfaith dialogues,
Yeah.
when it comes to some practice, what has been discovered is silence is the common language about the divine. And so when they participate in that, they can begin to understand themselves more if they also incorporate silence. Okay, so a last question. Good gosh, what got you into this business? What drove you to teach about religious thinking about God?
Yeah. How much time do we have? Oh man, so I'll try to be very, very short, but right, this is my story. I grew up in a very fundamentalist environment, and by 8th grade, I thought the trajectory of my life was to be a pastor. I went to undergraduate planning to be a pastor, and I thought I had certainty about a lot of things, right? And I took some classes, some philosophy classes that corrupted the youth, and but I worked at a big mega church for 3.5 years, a church of 3,000 people, 20 years ago, and in that 3.5 years I was at that church, I saw the dark underbelly of church politics, and just about anything that you can imagine can happen of abuse, of corruption happened in those 3.5 years. And it's at the very same time I was reading philosophical texts and asking questions, and between that confluence of events, I decided I was much more interested in asking the questions than having the answers. And that's what compelled me to go to grad school in philosophy. But even as I went to grad school in philosophy, I was very interested to understand how religions have always had some type of philosophical lens by which we understand reality. Nobody just reads the Bible, right? Nobody just sees the world. And so I really wanted to understand how philosophy has shaped religion. And so that's always been kind of a part about what I do. And I'll just end with this, like that pastoral heart has just never left me. And I deeply care about my students. I'm an academic, but I believe that what I do really matters. And I really hope that really my goal is that my students become more compassionate people in the world. And so I view myself as doing both of those things still.
Well, gosh. Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Dr. Bahler.